Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Real Life Theology podcast. This is your host, Reagan Gibbs. Today's episode is going to help us understand how churches can move beyond growth to true multiplication by embracing disciple making, overcoming common barriers, and leveraging collaborative church planting strategies. So let's get into it.
Welcome. My name's Todd Wilson. I know a bunch of you. We are going to talk about Renew Movement today. We realized last night when we did this that we had several different, audiences. Some were coming wanting to know how to plant, and others were wanting to know how to affiliate with Renew Movement. And we are going to focus primarily on talking a little bit about the current state of church planting, and we're going to talk about Renew Movement, of what we're trying to do at Renew Movement to solve a number of problems in church planting and what it looks like to be affiliated with Renew Movement. So that's where we'll be spending our time. We're going to try to leave some time for Q&A. Just so you know, right after this is lunch. There's box lunches right out around the hall from here. We're actually doing Q&A over lunch too. So if you want to continue any kind of conversation in church planting after this session, we're still going to be right here. You can grab your lunch and come right back in if you want to. Let me introduce Brett Andrews over here is going to be talking in a couple of minutes. Brett's with New Life Christian Church. He's on the board of Renew, one of the founders with Renew Movement. Patrick Bradley is our operations guy at Renew Movement, passion for planting. Dave Putman is going to be one of our guys talking a little bit. And so we're going to, if you want to jump in and ask questions as we go, we'll either go ahead and answer them right then, or I'll say hold that thought and we'll get to them. So, that all fair? All right. Let me start with grabbing a file here that just came in. Perfect. We, just as a setup of our current reality in church planting right now, 2 national studies were done. 1 national study on disciple making, 1 on church planting. The national study on disciple making found that less than 5% of U.S. churches have a disciple making culture. The second study found that less than 7% of U.S. churches are reproducing or actively engaged in church planting. Those 2 studies, even though they're separate studies, are related. We would expect that so goes the disciple-making side of things, so goes the church planting side of things. So it would be out of the ordinary if we had the 5% disciple-making number, but we were seeing 50% of churches in church planting. Bobby Harrington, who's founder of D.org and part of Renew here, we've had conversations for years where, the chicken and egg syndrome. My mission in life has been to see church planting become normative in America. Bobby's about the disciple-making part, so I'm always able to say to him, well, you're my biggest problem, because I can't get the church planting part to where it needs to be if we can't get the disciple-making part where it needs to be. So where there's published national studies, I would especially encourage you to get the disciple-making culture one on 5%. It's available for free on the discipleship.org website. There's several related findings in that 5% number that if we were doing the expanded version of this workshop, we'd really press into. I'll just highlight one of the tensions is language, that even the word disciple-making and what disciple-making culture means. If I asked each of you in your own room to write down your definition, we'd probably end up with 10 different definitions of things. So having a unity of language is one. A second part of that finding found that our institutional programmatic posture for growth in the U.S. church is probably one of the biggest barriers to actually seeing a disciple-making culture get put in place. And so those kinds of findings are available inside. I just want us for this workshop to understand the relationship between the problem of 5% of churches having a disciple-making culture impacts the church planting part. And we want to try to solve that problem in what we're doing. You can move on, Patrick. A number of years ago, we wanted to have a framework for measuring where we are in church planting. And because the Bible doesn't give us a nice, convenient framework for how to measure multiplication, we just turned to math. And here's what I mean by math. The 5 circles you see on the board, what we're labeling level 1 is subtraction, level 2 plateauing, level 3 growing or adding, level 4 reproducing, and level 5 multiplying. Those are all just basic math things. If we take the first three levels, 1, 2, and 3, that's the bell curve of life. It's Solomon talking about everything has a season. Each of us in this room, we're born, we grow, we plateau, and eventually we die. It's the bell curve of life is levels 1, 2, and 3. All 320,000 churches in America right now are at level 1, 2, or 3. Regardless of whether they're involved in church planting or not, your church is either subtracting, plateauing, or growing right now. And you can go look at the characteristics of math and decide, you probably instinctively already know what your church is doing on those three. So when we did two different national studies, found that 35% of churches are subtracting, 35% are plateaued, and 30% are growing. So 70% subtracting or plateaued, and 30% growing. You might be inclined to say, that's terrible. I think if we looked at the history of Christianity, I would be surprised if it's not far off from those numbers for the last 2,000 years. So I don't know that the fact that 35, and 30, don't interpret that as a problem necessarily. If the truth of the bell curve of life is everything has a season, then there's a distribution of the adding, subtracting, and plateauing, and 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 doesn't seem too terrible. Where we get the problem on this chart is when you get to reproducing. So just imagine 100% of churches have a level 1, 2, or 3 characteristic. Of those 100% of churches, we then measured what percentage of those 100% that are at level 1, 2, or 3 also have a level 4 or 5 characteristic to them. So you could be subtracting and still reproducing at the same time. In fact, let's say you were a church that planted a church every single year, and you were running 200 people, and you sent 20 people every year to plant a new church. You might be subtracting, but still reproducing. So don't equate, this is not a linear path that, we can't reproduce until we move from subtracting to plateauing and plateauing to adding. Any church that's at level 1, 2, or 3 is one decision away from being at level 4. The level 4 characteristics of reproducing, we just need to embrace and do. The difference in level 4 and 5 then, where our problem comes in, do you have one labeled for 4? So the national studies that have been done, you said you do or don't? It's okay. At level 4, 7% of U.S. churches have a characteristic at level 4. If you want to be a pessimist, 93 out of 100 churches don't have a reproducing characteristic and aren't involved in planting. If you get all the way to level 5 multiplying, 0%. You can only, statistically, there's only a couple of churches that would meet a mathematical definition of multiplying in the U.S., and it's such a small number that it rounds to 0. So,
can I ask a question?
Yes.
What do you mean exactly when you say 7% have the characteristic of growing or
of reproducing?
Of reproducing.
Right.
What is it that they have? 2 of 5 characteristics, or do they have all 5 characteristics?
The national studies we've done, there's actually an online assessment tool for free that your church can go to and measure where it is on 1 through 5. So anytime you're doing a statistical study, there has to be a quantifiable how they measure it. So what we did was we've got multiple characteristics that represent reproducing. It could be financial contribution, it could be sending planters, it could be, there's about 10 different factors. You don't have to be doing all 10 to be considered reproducing. The algorithm just says, the way I like to tell people practically is, if a duck came walking through the room waddling and quacking, we would all say that has the characteristics of a duck because it looks like a duck and it's quacking. We've sort of done the same thing with reproducing. What does a reproducing church look like? Well, they would be putting some kind of money into church planting. They would be trying to raise up leaders to plant. But they don't have to have them all is the key to get into. In fact, the 7% is a very low bar, actually. So it's not a super high bar.
Todd, who did those 2 studies?
Lifeway, we hired Lifeway Research to do the first one. These were prominent national studies. So Lifeway did the first one, and a separate independent company called Gray Matters did the second one. And these were full-blown, statistically valid national companies that did them.
And came up with the same conclusion.
Okay, and on the 35-35-0, both studies came up with the same results.
And how recent were those studies?
Those were before COVID, like right before COVID. 2019, 2017 were the two. And then the 5% disciple-making culture, that one was done by Gray Matters. That was the 5% result.
2019.
2019, right before COVID. So the other thing to just understand right now is we can look at the chart and say, oh, multiplying. The thing we have to realize is we can't just decide we want to multiply. Multiplication is not something we choose to do. Multiplication is the fruit or outcome of reproducing consistently over time. So just think family-wise. You can't multiply your family. You can reproduce and have kids, but to get to multiplication, your kids need to have kids, and their kids need to have kids. All we can do is one generation in front of us, and that's why if we really bottom-lined it for our churches, let's all aspire to be level 3 at our core, growing. Who doesn't want to be growing if they can't be? So growing is good. Let's try to be growing, but let's also be reproducing. And then let's faithfully reproduce over and over and try to have kids who have kids so that we get the fruit of seeing multiplication. What we like to say for people is when we do the studies, when you look around the world at international movements, Shadonke Johnson was in here last night and he affirmed individual churches don't multiply. It's the collection of churches together that are multiplication. In other words, Ralph Moore is the guy in the U.S. I think we've now identified close to 3,000 church plants out of the roughly 50 that he did. But his church started 50 churches. That's still reproduction at level 4. They were reproducing, but it's the fruit of those churches planting churches that get to the 3,000 church plants. And so it's the network affiliation of the collaborative that gives you the level 5 behavior. What we can do as organizations and churches is faithfully try to do level 4 in a way that is capable of seeing level 5 as the fruit or the outcome. And here's the tricky piece is, and we're not going to go here today, it's a whole other workshop, how you add makes all the difference. And what I mean by how you add makes all the difference, if the way you do level 3 is programmatic and not disciple making as the growth part of it, programs don't reproduce. How you add makes all the difference. I can't take an inanimate object. If I take this marker, and I even have to be careful the language I use with you. So here's a marker, 1. And now I put another one there. What have I done? I haven't reproduced this marker. 1 plus 1 is 2. I've added to the marker. So go with me. I have one church service. And now I start a second church service. Have I added or reproduced? I've added. No matter how much you think you were just reproducing this service to another one, you have not reproduced. You've added. To reproduce, both biblically and mathematically, the definition of reproduction, this thing has to have 2 characteristics. It has to have the ability to reproduce itself, the authority and the ability to reproduce, and it actually has to practice it and do it. In other words, let's say my wife and I have the ability to have kids, and we choose not to. We have not reproduced. We had the ability, but we didn't do it. Let's say for a minute, now I'm stretching you here, but I'm doing a dumb thing. Let's say my wife and I were not allowed to have kids unless our parents approved. We literally somehow they could change our biology. Like they had to turn on a switch, and we literally could not reproduce unless our parents turned the key to let us reproduce. We're not really, that you really don't have a system of reproduction. You have a system of adding, because just like I'm the living thing that's holding the pens, if I'm the one that controls it, and this thing doesn't actually have the authority or the ability to reproduce itself, then no matter what you think you're doing, you're only adding when it's all, if it's a third party that has the control of it. And the reason I'm going this level of detail now is, let's take, instead of there's one service and now we add a second service and we haven't reproduced. So let's get harder. We add a third service and a fourth service and we're out of space and we're out of time. And we decide, hey, this multi-site thing's the greatest thing ever. Let's start a new site. Have we reproduced or have we added? We've added. It is not reproduction. And here, until we've yet to see the model in the US where it's reproduction. What would have to happen in a multi-site model? Here's 3 campuses, and now we want a 4th entity. What would have to happen for this to be reproduction instead of adding? Go back to my 2 criteria. This has to have the authority and capability on its own without someone else's permission to reproduce itself, and it has to do it. If anybody's got a model in America where a site of a church has the authority, independent of anybody else, to decide on its own to start another one, we've not seen that model yet. There's always a central person like me. I'm the central elders, I'm the central authority, who is deciding what's going to start. That's addition, it's not reproduction. Now here's the thing that gets us now finally in trouble. I'm going to link it back to this. So now let's say we plant a church. I'm the parent, and we reproduced and planted a church. What happens now with this church? Does it turn around and start new churches or not? And here's where it gets tricky. If this church that just got planted never turns around and reproduces, I didn't really reproduce, I only added. For this to be reproduction, it's generationally got to reproduce. Is that making sense? And right now, if I link it back to this, both of those studies that we did showed that 75% of church plants, so we plant a church, 75% of church plants don't turn around and reproduce. And what ends up happening when you don't reproduce, you cut off, you can't get the multiplication because you cut off the generational reproduction.
I don't remember it either. So essentially what you're saying is, for the getting to the addition in number 4, if those churches, those 50 churches, you used that analogy earlier, the 50 churches didn't reproduce, that's not the 50 churches that were planted. Now we're just adding, for it to make that leap, those have to reproduce at some rate. I would assume not all 50 of those churches will reproduce, but there's some rate of reproduction within those churches.
Yeah, and I don't want to get stuck on fine points of things. I'm saying, in reality, if your church plants another church, you have reproduced. But if we're stepping back to look at the system of it, if every church you plant, if none of them turned around and planted again, you don't have a reproducing system. You're really just adding. Why not do campuses? You're just adding because none of them are turning around and reproducing. Your basic, if that were the case, that every church you planted didn't turn around and reproduce, it's impossible to get to multiplication.
So you're saying basically every crop needs a seed in it type thing? Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And not only does it need the seed, it needs to produce a harvest. So that's what we're trying to do with Renew Movement. The fair question, and Brett's going to come up and talk to us, is if only 7% of churches are reproducing, Why aren't more churches reproducing? Because we've got to move this toward multiplication if we're going to stop losing ground in the U.S. So Brett's going to talk to us about why more churches aren't reproducing.
If there's one thing that I want you to leave with today, it's just being convinced that every church is one church away, is one decision away from multiplying, from being a church planting church. Having said that, if we can just back up to get to just to remind ourselves of the why. We don't care about multiplying and reproducing because we want better systems and organizations. Why? Let's remember, this is all about reaching lost people. There's no more effective means of reaching lost people than starting new churches. That's why reproducing and multiplication. Americans love organizational stuff. If you build it, they will come kind of thing. Missionaries who are actually doing are part of multiplying movements, they're focused on people reproducing and multiplying. So just to that is the assumption that is underneath all of this. Part of the reason that multiplying matters is not so that we can be a superior church to churches that are adding or plateaued. It's because we own our generation. Ying Kai has started a multiplying movement of churches and church planters and disciples in China. I think the last they counted was 150,000 churches that they'd started. Reproducing churches, reproducing disciples. Why? It's because Ying grew a church to about 250 people in, 5 years. And he realized, I'm never going to make an impact on China if this is the rate of growth. How do we multiply disciples? That big question of there's so much lostness in our generation and we have to own it, drove a multiplying movement. So just to keep all of this in the context of reproducing and multiplying and adding, it's about, there are a whole bunch of people headed for hell, and if we're going to reach them, we have to have a higher level of expectation for what God will do through us and wants to do through us. And for what it's worth, I look at this and thinking New Life was a subtracting church during COVID, but we were still reproducing. See, if every church is one decision away from being a church planting church, the second thing that I think we need to understand is the key to taking our generation for Christ is ordinary people in ordinary churches. It's not mega church kind of leaders, these amazing leaders with amazing gifts who can do amazing things, because then most of us will sit in rooms like this and say, well, they're really good, I can't do that. But God hasn't made a mistake by calling us into ministry as ordinary people, as people who may never have huge churches. The key is ordinary churches, ordinary. So why is it that ordinary churches and ordinary people aren't planting churches, that start churches? I think it's why we get stuck in changing in general, why we don't change. I saw this, somebody had this years ago. So the way that we tend to function is behavior, attitudes, beliefs, worldview. Our behaviors are impacted by attitudes, beliefs, worldview. For what it's worth, it's easier to, if you want to use this in another way, most of the time it's easier to change beliefs than behavior. This is why homosexuality and homosexual marriage is popular today. It's not because we've all of a sudden come up with new morality that we think, this is superior morality. It's because there are a whole bunch of people that couldn't change, decided they didn't want to change, and so they just changed their beliefs about homosexuality and marriage and transgender now and all that kind of stuff, okay? So what is it that keeps us stuck in churches? Well, we say we want to go and make disciples of all nations. We're going to have to plant churches that reach lost people and disciple people and reproduce disciples. We believe that, but we're not doing it. And when that creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. You can't behave in one way and believe another way, and without something changing. You can't live in that dissonance, that disharmony. And so what happens in churches is we'll change our beliefs. We'll just say we can't plant. We don't have the ability, but and there are two fears, I think, that keep us from the behavior of planting and reproducing, that the beliefs that affect the fears that affect the beliefs. The first fear is the fear of scarcity. You're a church of 100, you're a church of 50, you're a church of 200. You hardly have enough money to pay the bills. We don't have the, how can we plant a church? We don't have the ability. How large was your church, Dan, when you planted?
250.
Okay.
200.
And how old were you?
2 years.
Yeah, 2-3 years. Okay. So the second fear, so the fear of scarcity, we don't have enough resources, people, money. The second fear is the fear of lack of wisdom. We don't have the ability, the knowledge to do it. If I gave you a box for a cake and directions for making the cake, how many of you would feel like you could bake the cake? Okay, well, good. I probably still couldn't. If I showed you a picture of a cake, and you just know in general, okay, I'm going to need some flour, going to need some water, going to need some time, going to need an oven. How many of you would say, I could make that cake because of the picture and knowing No, my grandmother could do that. There'd be some people who are smart enough, intuitive enough, they've baked enough, they could do that, but very few people can. Why don't most churches plant? Because, first of all, they say we don't have the ability financially and we don't have the wisdom. There are a few that are people like my grandmother making cake. They can figure it out on their own and they can do it, but they're rare. How do you overcome those fears? The first one is, I think that we have to, I go back to Matthew 5:5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the meek, God controlled, God tamed. They obey God, and they trust that God is going to provide. When you're a church of 200 or 250, and you send out people to plant, you're sacrificing money, you're sacrificing talent, and the only way you can do that, you're sacrificing momentum in your own church. The only way you can do that is to say, we're obeying God, and God's going to provide. That's blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. The second key, I think it's Proverbs 14:11 or 11:14. There's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. And so I think one of the keys in overcoming those two fears is, back to this whole multiplying thing, is planting with other church planting churches. You don't have to do it alone. And when we plant together as the church with other churches, then we do have God does provide for us the resources. God does provide for us the wisdom, and we can move forward. I'll leave it there, and want you to take it over.
I want to sort of talk about Renew Movement, which is connected with Renew, the gathering we're here with. And what we're trying to do at Renew is solve a number of the problems that we're talking about right now by how we allow people to affiliate to plant churches together. There's a couple of things driving what we're doing. One is the idea that it's churches that plant churches. And we're trying to push the church planting out to churches collaborating together to plant churches. And the second idea that Brett has said, we really believe that any church is one decision away from being involved in church planting. All of those scarcity things, I call it the someday when syndrome. Someday when we have the money, we have the talent, we have the time, we have the fill in the blank, we'll get involved in church planting. We want to take that away, that someday when is today, that there's no reason that a church can't right now get involved in church planting. So with that, I'm going to walk you through what we've done for a couple of years right now, getting ready for this, is looking across the spectrum of what's been happening in church planting, the reality of the U.S. context, and we've started with 6 distinctives at Renew Movement of what really distinguishes what we're doing in all of the planting. And I'm going to walk you through those things. Our mission is to actually see collaboratively together planting biblically centered disciple-making churches that reproduce. And so 6 distinctives. We start with sound theology. This may sound crazy. It's hard to find church planting networks today that are theologically centered. Most church planting networks that are out around the country, money's a big issue. We need lots of partners. the theology part kind of gets pushed aside and is not really the distinctive of the network. We're bringing that back in Renew Movement. We will be theologically a distinctive. That distinctive is the Renew Faith Statement. So it's available online. Second issue for us is disciple making as the primary mission and growth engine of the church. We want to see, if I go back to level 4 and 5, that how you add makes all the difference. The genius in Jesus-style disciple making is it's naturally reproducible. If our growth engine and mission is disciple making rather than institutional programs, we want to see church planting being done in a way that disciple making is really getting built into the DNA of the churches. Healthy support. We like to say there's 4 legs of the support stool in starting a new church: coaching, training, project management, and assessment. And so we're offering all 4 of those things embedded in Renew Movement so that when the churches come together to collaborate together, they're not having to worry about the support part of it. The money that comes together to plant goes directly into the church plant. The 5th distinctive is accountability. We've seen over and over a couple of problems with accountability. You can get the best planter in position who's aligned with what you're doing. And as soon as the management team's out of place, that planter can, I hate to say, do what they want. The planter may leave and someone else comes in. We've got to have accountability structures in place that if we're serious about the other issues of reproduction and theology and so forth, that there's accountability structure in place. Did I skip reproduction? I'm realizing right now I skipped reproduction. So we are, that whole issue that 75% of church plants aren't turning around and planting, we are starting churches, and the way we're doing it is that church plants can immediately be involved in church planting from day one. Our goal is that a church plant on their opening day stands up and announces the church plant that they're involved in. And so we've put a model together to allow that to happen. The last is collaboration, which really drives the model that we're using. Collaboration means if we do it together, the combination of the role at Renew Movement will be to bring together groupings of churches that want to plant churches together. So imagine 5 churches coming together, pooling their money, so that no one church needs to have all the money, no one church needs to have all the leaders, the expertise. We will attempt to have a strong church planting church part of each grouping of churches, so the expertise is there. The money comes from those churches pooling their resources together. And we don't have to, one church doesn't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. One church can put a smaller amount of money in and be part of the collaborative that's planting the churches together. Those 6 distinctives, theology, disciple making at the core, reproduction in the DNA, healthy systems, accountability, and collaboration, those will define continually what we're doing at Renew Movement. So when we say every church can be one decision away from planting, we literally mean right now, if you take the pilot church plants we've started doing at Renew Movement, let's say any of your churches that are represented here, if you weren't currently involved in church planting, if the leadership of the church decided today we're ready to be involved in church planting, because our plants are collaborative, you can immediately jump in and be involved in a church plant. You're literally a decision away from being involved. You don't have to have all the expertise. You don't have to have all the money. You can jump into a church plant from day one.
Yeah, can I clarify something? I'm sitting here thinking nobody is going to understand the vision for a new movement better than the people in this room right now. And so for you all to be advocates, to understand why we're doing what we're doing with Renew Movement, when we talk about theology and accountability, we don't live in, New Life started in 1993. We don't live in 1993 anymore. The theological pressures on our churches and young ministers is greater than I think it's ever been. We live in a more hostile time than ever for Christianity. Therefore, the need for more doctrinal clarity in the churches as they're getting started, and a greater sense of loving mutual accountability. You say one of the dangers of being Restoration Movement churches, independent churches, is the churches get started and maybe a church organization or a bunch of churches have come together and you've invested $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 to get this church started. And you have this young minister, we've had it happen more than once, when you hire them, where they are theologically is one place, and then 5 years into it, they've been influenced by other voices, and they're going a different direction. And you're just thinking, oh my word, we just started a church that's teaching bad theology. What a waste of investment. Now they're leading people in their own direction. The other thing that happens is the churches will get started. That planter will leave, and they'll bring in some. Who are your elders? Your elders in these young churches are either new Christians or they're people from other denominations. Often, theologically, they're not grounded in what we would call sound biblical theology, and so what you have in the next year, so that senior minister leaves, the elders take over. They hire somebody who doesn't agree with the theological foundation of those that started the church, and all of a sudden, that woman who was given $15 a month to support church planting in your church or this organization, her money has gone toward starting a church that she would completely disagree with. So this idea of accountability with clear, renewed theology and relationships moving forward that keep the planter and the church accountable is huge. And so understanding that vision for Renew movement is just huge. The need for this, I think, is greater than it's ever been. I've told Bobby, God led him for such a time as this.
Just to get into a little bit of detail, we've got 4 primary pathways for planting. The first is collaborative that we just talked to. Let's jump to that slide real quick. Collaborative is simple as 4 or 5 churches or organizations, networks come together to commit to plant a church together, pool their resources, use the best practices of Renew Movement. We provide the infrastructure support. The churches come around and serve as the temporary elders and management team of the new church and supporting it. So this is subtle. Renew Movement is not in competition with other church planting organizations. In fact, if you're paying attention to the detail, Renew Movement doesn't plant the churches. We help mobilize the churches that are planting the churches. We just pour gas on what's happening and make it, our goal is to make it possible for any church in America to be one decision away from planting and jump in and be able to do it. Let's go back to the models. So collaborative is our biggest approach. The second is the parent model. If there is a church that for whatever reason says, we don't want to collaborate, we want to be affiliated with Renew Movement, plant a Renew Movement church plant, and we're just going to fund it and do it all ourselves, they still have to meet the distinctives, but they could do it without the collaborative approach. We don't think that'll be normative, but that's a path. The pioneer path is we're seeing an increasing number of planters who are wanting to do new and different things, micro churches or disciple-making ministries or business for mission kinds of things. So we've got an entire pioneering category. Kane Atkinson, who's here at the conference, is one of our planters in this category. He's bivocational. He's connected with a business leader. He's employed by that business leader, but he now has his time free to do the church plant model, and it's a disciple-making model. So instead of we'll say a $300,000 3-year church plant, what's his budget, Patrick? $30,000 a year or something to support what he's doing, and he's doing a work in the ground for a lower amount. That's a pioneering model approach. And then the fourth is affiliate. Jeff in the back is with Florida Church Planters. We have a number of networks that do church planting, that they will keep doing their church planting, but their planters want to also be affiliated with Renew Movement. So those networks will affiliate, still be the primary, we'll say the primary logo on the car, and then Renew Movement is a supporting element to that. So those 4 are the planting pathways, and then jump to types of affiliation. We're calling it affiliation, not in a legal sense, but individual leaders can choose to affiliate with Renew Movement. The biggest way we're seeing that at this point will be, I see 2 happening. The big one right now is a planter who says, I want to plant, I don't have an affiliated group, I want to plant with Renew Movement. So planters who say, I want to plant with Renew Movement they would initially just affiliate as a leader. We would then plug them into one of the primary pathways, the collaborative, the parent, the pioneer. We'd get them into one of them. A second affiliation is a church affiliation. So if you guys are with churches, your churches can affiliate with Renew Movement. And affiliation means you're committing to do church planting with other churches. It's not a membership fee to Renew Movement. We are the stir the pot instigators, pour gas on what you're doing and help you make it. But you would be planting churches, jumping in, planting with other churches. Independent network affiliation, that's the one like with the Florida Church Planters. And then strategic partner affiliation. We have partners who, like Maritime Christian, Tim Cook in the back, will have a growing number of strategic partners who want to add value to church planting. And so all of these partners have to be aligned with the 6 distinctives of Renew Movement. That's what ties all the different partner types together. Let's pause and do some Q&A before we get to the other things. That's the fly-through of Renew Movement. Do we have the handout of Renew Movement, Patrick? So there's a couple of places you can go. We're going to give a handout on Renew Movement. There's much more detail. The website, renew-movement.org, is where you can get more information on Renew. We would encourage you, depending on where you are in the journey, if your church is ready to take that step to be involved, the most immediate direct thing you can do is affiliate with Renew Movement. It doesn't take away from your relationships with other groups or whoever you're with, but if you're ready to jump in and start planting churches with others, you can jump right in with Renew Movement. So renew-movement.org. What questions do you have so far on what we're talking about?
You mentioned churches working together to church plant. My question has to deal with when you have churches that are different denominations.
Yep.
How do there's subtle differences
Yep.
in many denominations. How is that? What is your experience, or how does that work out when you have opposing views on
So
church?
it's
Can you repeat the question?
Yep. The question is, how does it work when you have different theological backgrounds, whether it's in the form of denominations or what, that are trying to work together to plant churches together? And so that's where there's 2 ways I'll come at this. New Life, we years ago, 20 years ago, on what I'd call the beginning of the collaborative network era, we jumped in on the very beginning of a thing called the Emerging Leadership Initiative that was aiming at, let's bring denominations together to plant churches together. And it was simultaneously a really good thing and a bad thing. The relationships we built to this day are still producing fruit. What did we spend, Brett? We spent like 3 years to plant the first church together across denominational lines, because things like,
Was that his church?
no, it was one before that. Baptism, is it by immersion or is it by sprinkling? And you run into issues on that's why the theological distinctive is number 1 for us. As long as groups can align theologically on issues, then that's where we'll cluster the churches together that are aligned theologically together. As soon as there's not theological alignment, it doesn't mean the churches shouldn't do stuff together. It's just they've got to find their context separate from probably the groups we would put together if they can. It's going to be very hard if a group wants to do collaborative planting and they have strong theological distinctives, they're going to have a hard time doing it together across the theological lines. What's happened in the church planting space, when I said most networks are not theologically centered now, the way they've gotten around that is just said, we're not going to make theology an issue. Let's just be about getting more churches planted. And now you lose what Brett's talking about. Now you lose the rigor of biblical truth because you're diluting it out. So the way we're handling it is one of the 6 distinctives is the theological thing. And so if a church were to come to us and they weren't theologically aligned with our faith statement, we would still encourage them, hey, you need to find like-minded churches to go do your thing. It's just, in our case, our distinctive where Renew has a faith statement, that will be the unifying thing is the Renew faith statement, that if a church signs up to it, then we shouldn't run into the problems about being across lines. And denominationally, there's some of the denominations that can sync, or I'll say people with a denominational background, there can be enough syncing up where it works, and in other cases it doesn't work. What other questions?
So, I'm from Pittsburgh.
Uh-huh.
A lot of dying churches, Christ Christian churches.
Yep.
At what point do we say it's easier to come beside a church to help them and build them up, or we're just going to do it ourselves with the church plant because it's easier?
Yeah. I think there are ministries that do revitalization, and we're not trying to get at Renew Movement, we're not trying to get in the revitalization space. So unapologetically, we're going to cheer on the groups that are doing revitalization work. Now, we need to update our slides because there's a fifth pathway to planting that's not shown on the slide. We've added a legacy church category. We are absolutely seeing a growing number of cases where a dying church, what do? They'd like to give their resources or see a new church birth out of what they're doing. So we actually have a legacy church category for planting. Now, what the distinctive, though, it's not revitalization. In our category, there's been enough work done on this topic. It rarely works to have I'll say a dying or struggling church that's going to donate and you're starting a new thing, unless they'll shut down for 6 months. And so our criteria in a legacy church category is, the very first question is, are the current elders willing to shut the church down for 6 months? If the answer is no, we're going to try to point them to some revitalization effort. We're just not going to get into I'm going to call it the sideways energy of that. But if they really are at a place where we would like to die to see a new thing be born, then we've got a criteria in our legacy path. Shut down for 6 months. There's about 3 or 4 criteria that go with it. But
Can you repeat that and then kind of define for me, would a legacy church be a 1, 2, or 3?
yeah, let me answer real quick, and then I'm going to defer to the Q&A time later because I want to get David up in our last 10 minutes. But the question is a legacy church a 1, 2, or a 3? The definition of what we're calling a legacy church is when a declining level 1 church gets to a point that they conclude they're not viable anymore. They're down to 25 people. They barely can mobilize getting the grass cut. But here's what's ironic. Many of them might have $500,000 in the bank and own a $3 million piece of property. But it's a Depression era mindset. It's the scarcity thinking, not in church planting, the scarcity thinking in church. They just don't think they have enough to afford a pastor to do, which is a leadership issue. And their next step is going to be death. It's just a matter of what's going to happen once they die. Is it going to go to some commercial developer? We call a legacy church a church that is on a path toward death, and they decide, let's intentionally shut down to give new life to a new work starting. Let's birth a new church out of our dying church. And what I was saying was, rarely does that work unless the dying church agrees, leadership-wise, to let it shut down for 6 months and be shut down for 6 months and basically start under new management. So basically, they're transferring the assets to the new leadership for a new thing. And the old church, the legacy church, would celebrate the death and the rebirth. I can go into more detail on that. What I'm going to do, because we've got about 10 minutes, we've got Q&A over lunch. We've got 2 more opportunities in addition to affiliating with Renew Movement that we're implementing. We're kicking off in the fall these 2 initiatives David's going to talk to us about. One for church planners, one for church planting churches.
Yeah. Super. I'll take about 5 minutes of the 10 minutes left, and then we can go back into Q&A. So really the question here is, if only 7% are reproducing in any way whatsoever, and let's be honest, out of that 7%, how many of those are really doing healthy reproduction? The number begins to shrink. And so 3 years ago, Todd was leading Exponential, and he reached out to our organization, Oxano, and so we entered into a relationship. What we're really good, we have an execution bias, and part of the concern we had collectively together is, how do we move from addition to multiplication? And it seems that we all have this tendency that we love information, and the more we sit up under information without action, we become inoculated to talking about church planting, multiplication, disciple making, never get a lot of action done. And so our goal was to take, 15, 18 years of the best multiplication thinking on the planet, and to take our sort of how-to resources or design skills and put together a how-to toolbox for church planting. And so again, the big objective is, hey, if we're one decision away, then how can we be more intentional about making that decision? And so that's what we did. We sort of had to push to get there through these 5 shifts. So when I talk about the 2 opportunities, what we're talking about is really tools, as Todd indicated, one for planners, one for churches, existing churches. But built in it was this idea that we had to work through these 5 paradigms. And so this is just part of the design from program to disciple making. So unapologetically, everything we do in these processes is driven by the disciple making engine. Now they're contextual, so it's really up to the church how far you go with that. But again, disciple making engine. The second shift is from growth to saturation. The prevailing model that we talk about is an addition-based model of growth. The goal often becomes that of, if I'm a church planner, I planted a sustainable church, but saturation, gospel saturation, our goal and what is built into the process is more the mindset, hey, how do we go from level 3 to level 5? How do we go where be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth with God's glory? How do we get there? That everyone, everywhere is only one person away from someone who can share the gospel with them. They know someone who can share the gospel with them. From accumulation to mobilization, again, that idea that we accumulate, but how do we begin to build it off of and make that shift to mobilization? From hero, where I'm the hero, to hero maker, and then lastly, from good intentions to action. How do we really develop a process that's going to produce actions? So when we looked at both of these processes, they're similar but very, very different. But we talked about 4 outcomes, and the first outcome is that we want to see happen is we want to see you in every church tune up their disciple-making engine. And if it doesn't exist at all, then maybe we need to install it. That's a bit more revolutionary in our approach. But secondly, we have built into the process a second outcome, which is a new multiplication scorecard. In my personal ministry, through Planting the Gospel, we're a disciple-making movement. We have one measurement that we recognize that changes everything we do, and it's how many disciple makers are we reproducing. Not how many disciples, not how many churches we're planting, but for us, and it'll be different, I'm sure, for you, but it's disciple makers because they do all of these things that we're trying to get at. So what is a new multiplication? What are we measuring? What is that behavior that we're paying attention to and celebrating? And then, of course, a big challenge, and this is where our Oxano tools that we bring together really help, is aligning a multiplication culture. So how do we take beliefs and behaviors and begin to, with scorecard, and begin to align around those things where actually a new culture is beginning to bubble up. And so we work through that. And then the last outcome that we work towards is a multiplication plan. Most churches have some kind of plan, but by the time we get to the planning process, now we're beginning to move into this heavy multiplication bias. And when you begin a plan and you're planning for level 4 and level 5 versus level 3, all your planning looks radically different, And so those are outcomes. So there's 2 opportunities. One is the Multipliers journey. Again, that is designed for existing churches. Working with the Renew, we're launching, Todd and I'll be launching our next Multipliers Journey collab in October. And it will consist of 10 to 12 churches that'll come together over 6 months. We'll have two meetings on site at the beginning, at the end. The other will happen through virtual coaching. And we invite you to bring your teams with you, 3 to 5 people, because collaboration is a big part. And we'll help you walk through this 6-month process to design in these things that I've already spoken of. So that's one opportunity, and that's for existing churches. A lot of different ways we can apply that. We can take the tools and do it in a bunch of different ways we can talk about in Q&A. And then the MOS cohorts, that's a different process for church planners who are aspiring to be level 5 church planners. Okay, they're trying to plant churches, multiplying churches. And so what's going to be really important to them is they're beginning with a disciple-making bias, a disciple-making engine. And again, their end goal is to be a church that plants churches, that plants churches, that plants churches. And that's launching in September. That will consist of 10 church planters and their sponsor/coach. That's one person. But what we found is it works better when we have church planners and their coaches and sponsors working together, so they're not pulling apart. They're going in the same direction. So those are, and again, it will be set up similar. We'll have 2 live sessions that are a day and a half, and then we'll have a bunch of coaching. All this stuff, if you'll scan these codes, and all the details are in a handout I think we have, and they're also on the website at multipliers.org. So you can get a lot of information, or you can reach out to Todd.
I want to encourage you these are 2 really solid processes. And if I start with the Multipliers Journey one, the Oxano guys, if you don't know Oxano, they are a nonprofit consulting group that's one of the best in the country. You've probably heard of Church Unique, the Vision Frame. The tools that they have are amongst the best that are out there. They've basically taken their toolbox that they use in helping churches and consulting and put it into this custom process. The entire 6-month process, they're way underpricing what their work on it is. They're losing money on it, okay? It's $2,400 a church for 6 months for a team of 3 to 5 people. In reality, your biggest cost is getting 3 to 5 staff people to the face-to-face meetings. But I can't strongly enough affirm the work that Oxano's done, that if your church wants to either get involved in planting or wants to increase the current activity of planting, I really don't know of a better opportunity in America right now than what they've put together in this process. So we're thrilled to be partnered with it, to be able to offer a Renew Movement version of it.
Yeah, likewise.
Right. And then if you've got, part of this can just be having a front row seat to the process in your network or in what you're doing too. I talked to Jeff and the Florida Church Planters that they really Jeff ought to come and have a front row seat through the process and bring a church if he wants. Getting the front row seat to what we're doing is a big thing right now too.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the podcast. Make sure that you comment, like, and subscribe. And we thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.